It was one of those evenings that felt like it should have been normal. At least, that's what I tried to convince myself. I just wrapped up a brutal day at the office, my head pounding from the constant stream of meetings, calls, and conference calls that made up my life as a corporate lawyer. I was exhausted. All I wanted was to come home to my wife, Laura, and maybe have a quiet dinner. But when I pulled into the driveway, something hit me. Something in the air. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and the energy's just off? Like people have been talking about you when you weren't there? Or maybe you've been the subject of some conversation you shouldn't have been. That's how it felt. Our house, the one I'd worked so hard for, looked just the same from the outside. Big, well-kept, with its neatly trimmed lawn and freshly painted trim. But walking inside, it wasn't the usual comforting scent of dinner cooking or the sound of Laura's laughter that greeted me. It was a weird kind of silence. A coldness that shouldn't have been there. "Laura," I called out, kicking off my shoes and setting my briefcase down. There was no answer, but I thought I heard the faintest sound of something shuffling upstairs. I stood there for a second, just listening. Maybe it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I headed into the kitchen, expecting to find her either cooking or sitting at the counter, scrolling through her phone like usual. But no, the kitchen was empty. The house was empty, or so it seemed. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. That's when I saw it. A bottle of expensive perfume, the one I didn't recognize, sitting on the counter next to her usual brand. A heavy floral scent filled the air, way too strong for my taste. It was the kind of perfume that screamed, "Someone's trying too hard." I frowned, feeling a pang in my chest I couldn't explain. Laura had always loved the perfume I bought her. It wasn't like her to switch things up. I walked further into the living room. The TV was on, but it was muted. There was a glass of wine on the coffee table, half empty. I didn't see her anywhere. I was about to turn around and head upstairs when I heard a car pull into the driveway. A red Mustang. That sound, the familiar rumble of Brian Thompson's car, made my heart drop into my stomach. I looked out the front window, just in time to see him stepping out of his car. Brian, my so-called friend. Our neighbor. The one who always seemed to show up at the most inopportune times. I watched him walk toward the front door, his grin way too wide for comfort. He had that smile, like he knew something I didn't. My blood started to boil, but I stayed put, trying to make sense of it. Was this all just a coincidence? Or was something else going on? I heard the doorbell ring and then the sound of the door opening. Laura's voice, almost too sweet, calling out to Brian in that tone she reserved for people she wanted to impress. "Hey, Brian. Come in, I just made coffee." I clenched my jaw. Coffee? Really? It was nearly 7 o'clock. I stayed by the window, watching as Brian slipped inside, his hand casually resting on her shoulder for a moment too long. The way they interacted, like everything was normal, made my stomach churn. It wasn't the first time I'd seen them together, but something about tonight felt different. Too familiar. Too comfortable. I could feel the anxiety building up in my chest, but I didn't move. I didn't know what I was hoping for, but I had a feeling that tonight was going to be the night everything changed. I had to know. Had to get to the bottom of it. That's when the thoughts started swirling. What was I supposed to do? Confront them? Make some big scene? No, I wasn't like that. But I wasn't blind either. Something wasn't right. And the worst part was, I could feel it in my gut. The same gut that had been telling me for weeks now that things weren't as they seemed. For weeks, I'd been noticing the little changes in Laura. The subtle shifts in her behavior that were just enough to raise an eyebrow. The way she'd started spending more time at the gym. The way she'd suddenly become obsessed with looking a certain way. Wearing new, tight yoga pants, expensive workout gear, the kind she couldn't possibly afford on her own. The strange midday showers, when she used to only shower in the mornings. And then there was the constant needing time for herself excuse. I'd been suspicious before, but now, after seeing Brian walk into the house like he belonged there, it all clicked into place. The signs were obvious, even if I didn't want to admit it to myself. Something was happening, and I didn't know how to stop it. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, not knowing if I should take the plunge or pull back before it was too late. But one thing was clear. I wasn't going to let this slide. Not without knowing for sure. I didn't confront them right then and there. Part of me wanted to storm into that living room, yell at them, tear it all apart. But I knew that wasn't going to help. I had to be smarter than that. I needed proof. And that's exactly what I was going to get. The first part of my plan was simple. Start paying attention. I didn't need to go crazy, I didn't need to stalk them, but I needed to be aware. I needed to notice the details. Something was off, and I had to prove it. As I sat there, watching Brian's car parked outside, I made a decision. I wasn't going to jump to conclusions, but I was going to watch closely. And when the time came, I would act. I'd make sure of it. The next few days felt like an eternity. I kept to my usual routine. Wake up early, head to the office, put in the hours, come home late. I didn't confront Laura right away, though every time I stepped into the house, I could feel the tension between us, thick enough to cut with a knife. She was trying to act normal, but I could see through the facade. It was in the way she avoided eye contact, how she'd smile too brightly and then quickly look away when she thought I wasn't watching. The little things, the tiny slips in her usual behavior, were the most telling. But I couldn't let her know that I was on to her. Not yet. I needed to gather more evidence. I needed to see if what I was feeling in my gut was true. Brian, on the other hand, seemed to show up more often than ever. He was always around, either knocking on the door with some helpful excuse, or casually leaning on the fence in the backyard, chatting with Laura like they were old friends. There were times I could swear they were exchanging some private joke, the kind that made Laura laugh a little too freely, a little too loud. That was new. She never laughed like that around me. Not anymore. One afternoon, I got home early from work. It was a rare thing, but I was feeling particularly restless, so I thought I'd surprise her. Maybe even ask her about Brian. But when I walked in, I froze. The door was unlocked, which was strange. Laura always locked it when she was home. I pushed it open slowly and stepped inside. The house was quiet. Too quiet. At first, I didn't see anything that raised alarm. But then I walked into the kitchen, and there it was, another sign. A set of keys on the counter. Not just any keys. Brian's car keys. I could recognize the damn thing anywhere. I'd seen him fidgeting with them 100 times when he visited. I knew those keys were his, but I didn't want to admit it to myself. It wasn't just the keys, though. It was the way Laura's perfume lingered in the air, mixed with the fresh scent of some kind of soap I hadn't recognized. I walked further into the house, feeling the weird knot tighten in my chest. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was a towel. On the floor, near the bathroom door. Now, Laura was a stickler for cleanliness. She didn't leave towels lying around. Ever. I knew something was wrong. But I still held back. No confrontation yet. Instead, I grabbed my phone and snapped a quick picture of the towel, then another one of the keys. If I was going to do this, I needed to make sure I wasn't just imagining things. I was about to go upstairs to look for Laura when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the stairs. Her voice followed soon after. "Ethan," she called, soft and almost too casual. I froze for a second, wondering if she could tell that something was off, that I was on to her. But I forced myself to be calm. "Yeah, just got home. How's your day been?" I asked, trying to sound normal, like everything was fine. "I was just in the shower," she replied quickly. Too quickly. I could hear the shower running upstairs. But the thing was, she had just showered that morning. Was she really taking another one now? I nodded, trying to swallow the growing sense of unease. "Oh, okay. I'll be upstairs in a second," I said, heading toward the stairs but not without a last glance toward the kitchen. I stood there, my pulse racing, feeling the weight of what I was about to discover. When I finally made it upstairs, I took my time. I needed to be patient, to not let on that I knew what was happening. But as I reached the landing, I saw the faintest bit of steam escaping from the bathroom door. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. Laura wasn't one for long showers, but I had a feeling this one was dragging on longer than usual. I stood at the top of the stairs, listening. Then my heart dropped. There was something off about the sound of the water. It wasn't just the usual steady stream. There was a sound, barely audible but unmistakable, the faint sound of muffled laughter. And then, I heard his voice. Brian's. It was barely a whisper, but there was no mistaking it. My own neighbor, in my house, in my bathroom, while my wife showered. I stood there, frozen. My mind raced, but I couldn't seem to move. How long had this been going on? How many times had I turned a blind eye, too caught up in my own life, to notice what was happening right under my nose? I had to leave. I couldn't stay up there, couldn't hear anymore. I needed to think. So I turned around and walked down the stairs, trying to keep my footsteps light, my breathing steady. I went straight to my office and locked the door behind me, just needing a moment to get my thoughts together. I tried to process what had just happened, but the images kept flashing in my mind. Her, laughing in the shower with Brian, the sounds of their secret world that I wasn't a part of. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pushed out, that the life I thought I had was slipping away, piece by piece, without me even realizing it. But what was I supposed to do now? How could I fix this? As I sat there in the dark, I realized one thing. I wasn't going to just let this go. I was going to make sure that I had proof. Hard, undeniable proof. And when the time was right, I'd confront them both. But not yet. I still needed more. For the first time in a long while, I felt something stir inside me. A kind of cold, calculated anger that I hadn't known I was capable of. I wasn't going to play the fool anymore. I was going to make them regret everything. The next few days felt like a blur of tension, sleepless nights, and quiet observations. I wasn't sure what hurt more, the fact that Laura was betraying me, or the way my whole life felt like it was crumbling without me even being able to do anything about it. But I wasn't going to sit around feeling sorry for myself. That wasn't the guy I was. I was a lawyer, after all, and lawyers don't let things slide. They gather evidence. They build cases. They make sure the truth comes to light, no matter how ugly it is. So that's what I did. I started documenting everything. I took pictures. I wrote down times. I noted every little detail that seemed off. Each time Brian showed up at the house, I made sure to keep track. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with the information, but I wanted to have it. I needed to know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that this was really happening. One afternoon, a few days after I caught that damn laugh in the bathroom, I decided to follow them. It wasn't something I wanted to do, but I knew it had to be done. I had to see with my own eyes just how far this thing had gone. Laura had told me she was going to a yoga class. I knew better than to take her word for it. As soon as she left the house, I grabbed my keys and headed out the door, trying my best to stay cool, keep it together. My car, a sleek silver sedan, wasn't exactly the most subtle thing, but I knew where to park and how to keep my distance. I drove a few blocks away from the house, parked near the edge of the neighborhood, and waited. I kept my phone on me, making sure the camera was ready, just in case I needed it. Sure enough, after about 20 minutes, I saw her car pull out of the driveway, a little too fast for someone on their way to a yoga class. She was headed in the direction of Brian's house. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed her. I wasn't exactly proud of what I was doing, but I was past the point of second-guessing myself. I had to know. I had to be sure. I kept a safe distance, but I didn't lose sight of her car. She pulled into Brian's driveway, and I had to swallow the bile rising in my throat. I knew what that meant. She wasn't going to a class. She wasn't meeting a friend. She was going to his house. I parked a few blocks away, out of sight, and waited. It felt like I'd been sitting there for hours, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. I needed to see what was going to happen next. I watched her walk up to the front door of Brian's house, knock, and then let herself in. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel, the anger bubbling up again. But I stayed put. I wasn't going to let my emotions get the best of me. Not now. Not when I was this close. The next hour passed in a blur. I didn't move. I barely blinked. I watched the front door of Brian's house like a hawk, trying to spot any sign of movement. But it was the small details that got to me the most. Brian's truck, his red Mustang, was parked in the driveway the entire time. No one else came or went. It was like the world had stopped, leaving just the two of them alone in their little bubble. And then, as the sun started to dip below the horizon, I saw them. Brian and Laura. Together. Standing on his porch. I could barely make out their faces from this distance, but I could tell they were close. Too close. Laura's laugh, that same laugh I'd heard before, rang out clearly, and Brian's hand rested on her lower back, a touch that was way too intimate for just neighbors. I didn't need to see more. My worst fears had been confirmed. I drove home in a haze. It was hard to focus on anything other than the images in my mind, the sight of them standing so damn close to each other, sharing their private moments, while I was left in the dark, clueless and oblivious. I couldn't understand how she could do this to me. The anger I felt earlier was starting to shift into something darker, something colder. But I wasn't going to confront her yet. Not yet. There was one more thing I needed to do before I decided what to do with all this. I went to the garage, grabbed my laptop, and logged into our shared account. The password was easy to crack. I'd always known it. She never bothered to change it, too comfortable with me, I guess. I spent the next hour scrolling through her messages, her emails, her social media accounts. At first, I didn't find anything, just the usual stuff. Her friends, work emails, some group chats. But then, near the bottom of her inbox, I saw it. A message from Brian. It was short, to the point, and unmistakable. The subject line read, "Just like old times." I opened the message. The contents made my stomach churn. "Can't wait to see you later. We'll keep it quiet, like we always do. Don't worry, I'm looking forward to it." My hands shook as I read it over and over, the meaning of it sinking in deeper with every word. This wasn't some innocent friendship. This wasn't just a neighborly visit. This was an affair. Plain and simple. It was right there in black and white. I had the proof I needed. I closed the laptop, letting out a shaky breath. My chest felt tight, but I wasn't about to fall apart. Not yet. I had a plan. I could have stormed upstairs, confronted her, screamed, demanded answers. But that wasn't the kind of person I was. I wasn't going to let her off that easily. She'd made her choice, and now it was time for me to make mine. I stood up from the desk, took a deep breath, and made my way to the kitchen. I needed to calm down. This wasn't the time for rage. I had to be smart about this. This wasn't just about catching her in the act anymore. This was about making her pay for what she'd done. The next part of the plan would be the hardest part yet. But I was ready. I knew exactly what I was going to do. The hardest part wasn't gathering the evidence. That was easy. The hardest part was sitting on it, waiting, watching, letting the anger simmer just below the surface without letting it consume me. I had to be careful. I couldn't let Laura or Brian see the storm coming. Not yet. They had no idea I knew what was going on, and I wasn't going to tip my hand too soon. So I kept up the act. I played the part of the clueless husband, the hard-working lawyer just trying to get through the day. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make any accusations. I didn't even let my eyes linger on Laura for too long. I was cool, calm, collected. But every time I walked into the house, it was like a slap in the face. The smell of her perfume mixed with Brian's scent in the air. The awkward silences between us, as if we were strangers sharing a roof. Every touch, every word, felt like a lie. I couldn't stand it. But I had to let it play out. I had to wait for the right moment to strike. And then there were the little things, things that made my blood boil. I caught Laura texting Brian late at night, her face lit up by the glow of her phone, her fingers moving too quickly to be just casual conversation. I didn't know what they were saying, but I didn't need to. I had all the proof I needed. I saw the way she hid her phone from me, the way she flinched when I walked into the room while she was on it. The guilt was written all over her face, even if she never said a word. I knew she was planning something. She always was. She wasn't the type to sit around waiting for life to happen. A week passed. It felt like an eternity. One evening, Laura came home late from some work event, her heels clicking against the floor as she walked in. She was dressed in something too formal for just a simple night out. A tight black dress, heels that made her legs look miles long, and that same expensive perfume, the one I'd never bought for her. I tried to keep my face neutral, but I couldn't help the way my jaw clenched when I saw her. You look nice, I said, my voice icy. I wasn't trying to be kind. I was trying to keep control. She gave me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Thanks, she said, but there was a nervous edge to her tone. She knew I was onto her. She paused for a moment, looking me over. Then, almost as if trying to prove something, she said, "So, what are you going to do tonight?" "Same as usual. Work tomorrow, so I'll probably hit the gym," I answered, keeping my gaze steady. She nodded, almost too casually, before disappearing upstairs to freshen up. But I wasn't going to let this slip through my fingers. No, I needed more. I needed to catch her, to prove it to myself beyond a shadow of a doubt. So, that night I made my move. I waited for the house to fall silent. The only sounds were the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic on the road outside. When I was sure she was upstairs, I slipped into the kitchen, grabbed the small hidden camera I'd been planning to install, and set it up in the living room, where she always left her purse. I made sure it was positioned just right, discreet, but effective. Then I waited. The next morning, I had everything I needed. The footage was crystal clear. I watched as Laura casually walked into the living room, dropped her purse on the table, and walked out the back door, phone in hand. But it wasn't the moment that caught my attention. It was what happened next. As she walked out, the camera caught Brian's truck pulling up to the house. It was subtle, but I could see the way he glanced around before stepping out, checking to make sure no one was watching. Then, in the dead of the night, he slipped into the back door, the door Laura had left wide open. They were together. Again. I leaned back in the chair, feeling the cold rush of anger hit me once more, but this time, it was different. I wasn't just angry. I was ready. Ready to end this, ready to make them both pay for what they'd done. But I needed one last thing before I pulled the trigger. The confrontation. I wanted them to know that I knew. I wanted to see their faces when the truth hit them. I didn't care about saving the marriage anymore. That ship had sailed the moment she decided to sleep with my neighbor. No, I was done with playing nice. I was done being the fool. That afternoon, after lunch, I called Laura to the living room. "Can we talk?" I said, my voice low but firm. She came in, looking as composed as ever, though I could see the nerves in her eyes. I could feel the tension between us, thick and suffocating. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the crack in her voice. She knew something was up. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I wasn't going to make this easy for her. "I know what you've been doing, Laura," I said, keeping my tone steady. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to cry. I was done with that. Her face went white. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, taking a step back. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. "I know about you and Brian. I know everything." I said it slowly, deliberately. She opened her mouth to deny it, but I cut her off, pulling up the footage from the camera. I didn't need to say a word. The video said it all. Laura's eyes went wide as she watched it, her hand trembling as she reached for the table to steady herself. "Ethan, please," she started, but I didn't let her finish. "No more lies, Laura. No more excuses. I'm done." And just like that, the truth hung in the air, thick and suffocating, just like the silence between us. She wasn't sorry. Not really. She wasn't even shocked. She was just cornered, and it was too late for her to run. The look on her face told me everything I needed to know. She didn't feel guilty. She felt trapped. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done to me. She was sorry she'd been caught. I didn't say another word. I turned on my heel and walked out, leaving her to stare at the screen in silence. As I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door, I knew it was only the beginning. I wasn't going to just leave it at that. I wasn't going to let her walk away without consequences. I had more planned. Much more. But for now, I had one thing I wanted: control. And I had it. I couldn't sleep that night. Not because of the conversation. I'd been prepared for that moment for days, maybe weeks. But because everything had changed. The life I thought I had, the future I thought I was building, was all a lie. And now I was forced to face the rubble of it all, staring at the wreckage that was my marriage. I didn't know what I expected her to do. Cry, beg for forgiveness, fall apart. But none of that happened. Laura, in the end, was just like I always feared, a master of manipulation, a woman who could lie and smile at the same time. The moment she was caught, she didn't crumble. She just adapted. After I left the living room, I heard her moving around upstairs. The sound of drawers opening and closing, the soft tap of her feet on the hardwood floor, her phone buzzing away as she typed a message. It was like nothing had changed for her, like she was trying to put the pieces of her day back together. But I knew the truth now, and that made it impossible to look at her the same way again. I couldn't even stand the thought of sharing the same space, the same roof, with someone who could betray me so casually. And I could tell she felt it too. The silence between us had thickened to something heavier than it had been before. The next morning, I woke up early. Too early. I didn't want to be in that house anymore. I needed space, time to think, to figure out what I was going to do next. Laura had left for work by the time I got up, leaving me alone in the silence. The house felt bigger somehow, emptier. I spent the day sorting through my options. It was tempting to go to Brian's house, knock on the door, and confront him. The idea of standing face to face with the man who had crossed so many lines was almost too tempting. But I held back. I didn't need him to understand what he'd done. I didn't need his apology or his excuses. All I needed was for him to know that the world would soon know what kind of man he really was. That would be enough for me. Laura came home late that night. I could feel her presence before I even heard her footsteps, like she was trying to sneak in, as if she wasn't already caught. She'd changed into one of her tight, revealing dresses, trying to act like nothing had happened. But I wasn't in the mood for games. "You didn't answer my question last night," I said, my voice calm, but I could hear the anger simmering beneath it. I hadn't even turned to look at her when she entered. I stayed where I was, staring out the window, watching the moonlight flicker off the glass. "I told you, Ethan," she started, but I cut her off, spinning around to face her. "No," I said firmly. "You didn't tell me anything. Not the truth, anyway. So we're gonna talk about this now. Really talk about it." She swallowed hard. The facade was cracking now, and I could see the frustration on her face. She wasn't prepared for this. Not for me to be the one in control. "I don't know what you want me to say," she muttered, her voice defensive, but her eyes were darting around, searching for an escape. I wasn't letting her off that easy. "I want you to tell me the truth, Laura. Why him? Why Brian?" I said, my tone sharp. "You've been lying to me for months. Maybe longer. Do you think I didn't notice? The late nights? The perfume? The way you'd go out 4 errands just to see him? You really think I was that stupid?" She stepped back, her face flushing red. "I never meant for it to get out of hand, Ethan. It was a mistake. A mistake, okay? I never wanted to hurt you." "Don't," I said, cutting her off again, "don't play that card with me. You don't get to play the 'it was a mistake' card when you've been planning this for months. You think I don't know about your late-night phone calls? Your little gardening sessions with him? You think I didn't notice how you changed after he started coming around? How you started looking at him like you look at me?" Her eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a tight, defensive smile. "So what do you want from me, huh? A big apology? For you to feel better about yourself?" I clenched my jaw, holding back the fury that wanted to explode. But I wasn't going to let her push me. Not anymore. "No. I don't need your apology," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want anything from you. You already gave me everything I needed when you let him into our lives." She seemed to shrink back, the guilt flashing in her eyes for a split second before she masked it with defiance again. "Fine. Then what? Are you just going to leave me? Is that it?" I shook my head slowly. "No. Leaving you won't be enough." That night, I didn't sleep. I just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the next steps. I had everything I needed. Proof. Motivation. And now, a new sense of clarity. I wasn't just going to walk away from this without making sure they both knew what it felt like to lose everything. But I wasn't going to do it the easy way, either. I had a plan. The next day, I went out to a local tech store and bought a small, high-quality microphone. I had a few conversations to record, and I needed them to be crystal clear. I also made sure to get some recording apps that could track phone conversations. I was going to put everything I had under a microscope, see just how far this thing went. I spent the next few days setting things up around the house, positioning cameras in strategic places and listening in on her conversations. I wasn't proud of what I was doing, but I needed to make sure I didn't miss anything. I wasn't going to let her or Brian worm their way out of this. It was time to get the final pieces of the puzzle. Once I had it all, I'd know exactly what to do. And when the time came, I was going to make sure they both understood that betrayal has consequences. Real consequences. The following days felt like a slow burn. Every moment spent in that house felt like a scene from a nightmare I couldn't escape. Laura kept acting like everything was normal, like nothing had happened. She'd come home late after work, change into her usual casual clothes, and sit down to dinner like we were just your average married couple, happily eating spaghetti and talking about our day. But it was all a lie. It felt suffocating, being around her like that. I couldn't stand the sight of her. But I also couldn't look away. I watched her like a hawk, trying to catch even the slightest hint of guilt in her eyes. But she was good at hiding it, too good. One night, after dinner, I watched her go upstairs with her phone in hand. Her usual, "I'm just going to check something" excuse. I stayed in the living room, pretending to scroll through my emails on my laptop, but my eyes kept flicking up toward the stairs. I could hear her footsteps, muffled against the carpet, but I knew exactly what she was doing. Texting Brian. Or worse, on the phone with him. I didn't know how long I sat there, but when I finally stood up and went into the kitchen, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Laura's purse was on the counter, wide open, and there, right on top of her wallet, was her phone. Face up. Unlocked. For a moment, I froze, my heart racing. The temptation to grab it was overwhelming. I'd been waiting for this moment, craving it, and now it was finally here. I swallowed hard, the weight of what I was about to do settling in. But I couldn't back down. I had to know. I stepped forward slowly, picking it up with trembling hands. The screen lit up, showing a message from Brian. "Miss you. Can't wait for tomorrow." The text was simple, but the implications were massive. They were planning something. Again. This wasn't some one-time mistake. This was an ongoing affair. And now I had the proof. I stared at the message for a long time, my grip tightening on the phone. I felt a wave of disgust wash over me, but at the same time, I felt relief. Because now, finally, everything was laid bare. There was no denying it anymore. Laura could lie to my face all she wanted, but the truth was staring me right in the face. The next day, I decided to make my move. I had everything I needed now. The footage, the messages, the late-night phone calls. All of it. I wasn't going to wait for another perfect moment. I was done. I'd played this game long enough, and now it was time to end it. I waited until she got home from work, then made sure to take my time. I was calm. Controlled. I wasn't going to let her see how much this had affected me. I didn't want her to feel satisfaction knowing that I was still reeling from it. So, I waited for her to settle in. She came into the kitchen, threw her purse on the counter, and started rummaging around for something to eat. Normal, like always. But I wasn't fooled. I knew exactly what was going on. "Sit down," I said, my voice steady but cold. It was the first time I'd really spoken to her like this since I'd found out. She looked at me, her eyes wary. "What's wrong?" "Sit down, Laura. Now." She hesitated, then slowly took a seat at the kitchen table, folding her arms across her chest. I took a deep breath, making sure I had control over my emotions. I wasn't going to let her manipulate me anymore. "I have something for you," I said, walking over to the counter where her phone still lay. I picked it up, sliding it across the table toward her. "Tell me who this message is from." She looked at the phone for a second, then back at me, her face shifting from confusion to something darker. "What is this about, Ethan?" she said, her voice strained. But I could hear the panic creeping in. She knew what was coming. "Who's Brian?" I asked, my voice sharp. Her eyes darted around the room, as if she could somehow escape this. But there was no getting away from it now. I wasn't letting her twist this into something else. Not anymore. "Brian is," she started, but I cut her off. "Don't. I don't want to hear your excuses," I said. "I've been watching, Laura. I know everything. I've got the footage. The texts. The late-night phone calls. The trips. Everything. And I'm not going to let you lie to me anymore." She swallowed hard, her face pale now. "Ethan, please. I didn't mean for it to happen like this." I raised my hand, cutting her off again. "You didn't mean for it? You didn't mean for it to happen?" But it did. And now I'm the one left picking up the pieces. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. There were no more lies to tell. She knew it, and so did I. The silence stretched out between us. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I didn't let it show. I was the one in control now. I want you out, I said, my voice low but firm. I want you out of this house. Tonight. She stared at me, her face contorted in disbelief. You're kicking me out? After everything? Yes, I said, my tone unwavering. I'm done. I want you out. And I want Brian to know exactly what kind of person you are. Her face twisted into something ugly. She stood up quickly, knocking her chair back in the process. You don't mean that, Ethan. You're just angry. You don't know what you're saying. I do know what I'm saying, I replied, standing up to face her. I'm not your fool anymore. And neither is Brian. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you've done. You and him. I'll make sure they both know exactly how you've been treating me. You'll never be able to show your face in this town again, Laura. Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I saw the mask slip. She was no longer the woman I'd married. She was just another cheater, someone who'd used me, played me, and now tried to manipulate her way out of it. I'm not leaving, she spat. You can't make me. I just stood there, letting the silence hang. I wasn't going to beg her. I wasn't going to argue. I knew what needed to be done. Later that night, when she was gone, when she'd packed her things and walked out of the house for good, I sat alone, staring at the empty space around me. The house felt quieter now. Not emptier, but quieter. Like something that had been weighing on me for so long had finally been lifted. The revenge wasn't about breaking her. It wasn't about seeing her cry or beg. It was about reclaiming my life, my power. And as I sat there in the stillness, I knew one thing for sure. I was done being anyone's fool. It's funny how quiet a house can get once the storm's passed. The day after Laura left, everything felt still. Too still. All the noise, the tension, the constant wondering if she was texting Brian, if I was being lied to, it all faded. And I thought maybe I'd feel relief. Maybe I'd be able to breathe easier. But instead, I just felt numb. I spent the next few days at home, going through the motions. I made coffee, I ate breakfast, I cleaned up the messes she'd left behind. The things she'd left hanging around, like the perfume bottles, the little jewelry trinkets she wore on special nights out, the stray shoes scattered in the hallway. It was all there, pieces of her scattered around the house. But none of it meant anything anymore. Not to me. I didn't care about her things. I didn't care about the life we'd built. That life was gone. She was gone. And even Brian, her so-called friend who had been so bold about everything, wasn't the enemy anymore. The enemy had always been the lies. I spent the following week laying the groundwork for my next move. I knew exactly how I wanted to play this. Slow, deliberate, and with purpose. It wasn't enough to just expose the affair. I wanted them both to feel the full weight of what they had done. It wasn't about anger anymore. It was about control. I wasn't a vengeful person by nature, but this was different. I had been wronged in the most fundamental way. And now I was going to take back what was mine, piece by piece. The first thing I did was reach out to some of the people in our circle. Friends who had been friends with both of us. People who had always seen us as the perfect couple. I didn't want them to know everything, but I made sure they got the right picture. I dropped enough hints, let the truth drip out in just the right ways. By the end of the week, the whispers started. They didn't have to know every detail, but I made sure they knew what kind of woman Laura was. I also got to work on Brian. I wasn't going to let him off easy either. The guy thought he could just waltz into my life, into my marriage, and take whatever he wanted without consequence. He was wrong. I pulled some strings at my law firm, used a few connections I'd kept from back in the day. I made sure that the right people knew about Brian's shady dealings. Business deals that didn't add up, some financial discrepancies I'd heard about from mutual acquaintances, things I knew could cause him trouble if they ever came to light. I didn't do anything illegal. I didn't need to. I just made sure the right eyes were looking in his direction. Let him feel the weight of my anger without me having to say a word. His reputation would take a hit. No question about it. The whispers in the office, the doubts creeping in around the people he worked with, they would slowly eat him alive. It wasn't about ruining his career. It was about making sure he knew he wasn't untouchable. That everything he'd done came with a price. Then, a couple weeks later, I ran into Laura at a coffee shop. It wasn't planned, but of course it was going to happen eventually. She didn't know I'd been tracking her movements or making sure the right people knew what kind of person she was now. I kept everything under wraps, but I made sure her life wasn't as easy as it used to be. She was with a new guy. I didn't know who he was, but he sure looked the part. Well-dressed, a little too cocky, and clearly just as oblivious to everything as I used to be. I watched them for a few minutes, sitting there, acting like this was her new life. Like she was happy. But I could see it in her eyes. There was a certain emptiness behind the smile she wore. She hadn't expected things to go down like this. When she saw me, her face went pale. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. "Ethan," she said, her voice cold but a little shaky. "What are you doing here?" I didn't bother pretending like I was happy to see her. Instead, I just looked at her, studying the way she shifted in her seat, uncomfortable in her own skin now. "Just getting coffee," I said. "How's everything going with him?" I nodded toward the guy sitting across from her. Her smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "It's none of your business anymore, Ethan." I leaned in slightly, just enough to make her feel the weight of my words. "Actually, it is. You see, I've been keeping busy. Making sure people know what happened. Making sure your new friends, your colleagues, they all know the real story. And Brian? Well, I've made sure he knows what happens when you cross the line. I hope it was worth it." Her eyes widened, and for the first time in weeks, I saw her falter. Her confidence, her arrogance, everything she'd built around herself to shield her from the truth, cracked. She didn't have the power anymore. "I don't know what you think you're doing, Ethan," she spat, standing up quickly. "But you won't get away with this. You'll regret it." I didn't flinch. "Regret? You don't get it, do you? I'm not trying to get away with anything. I'm just making sure you and Brian learn the hard way that betrayal comes with consequences." I turned to leave, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of guilt pass across her face. But it was gone too quickly for me to be sure. Either way, it didn't matter. She had crossed the line, and now I was crossing it right back. A few months later, I ran into Brian at the gym. I saw him across the room, lifting weights, acting like everything was fine. But I could tell he was unsettled. His usual cocky swagger was gone. He looked over at me for a split second, but quickly looked away, as if hoping I wouldn't notice. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. He already knew. Things settled down after that. I didn't hear much from Laura or Brian. The whispers died down, and people stopped asking me about them. But I knew. I knew they both paid the price for what they'd done, and I was at peace with that. As for me, I started to rebuild. It wasn't easy, but I was learning to trust again, not just in others but in myself. I'd been through hell, but I'd come out on the other side stronger. And that's what mattered.